Today is the day that I've been waiting for. The last of the 3 animated movies from 2018 that I've been wanting to give justice to for quite some time now. Lewis and the Aliens. This has been an animated movie that I've been wanting to get off my chest for quite a while now. The story for this movie is a similar one to Monster Family, where back in 2018, being someone who had DirecTV at the time, I remember seeing a few TV spots for this movie playing during commercials, but not too many to the point where I was dreading this movie, given the fact that around this time when I was manually recording things from Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network, I often skipped the commercial breaks. Although, one thing to note about this movie is that it's distributed by the exact same company that distributed Monster Family, aka Happy Family, and just like Monster Family, this movie is absolutely terrible. If anything, I think that this movie is slightly worse than Monster Family. Wait a minute, didn't you say that Monster Family is one of the most unpleasant animated movies that you've ever seen? Well, yes, that is true, random audience member. And while Lewis and the Aliens isn't as unpleasant, even though, yes, this movie still has a ton of unpleasant moments that I'll be getting to in a little bit, nearly everything else in this movie is so much worse. Now, I know what you might be thinking. This movie is supposed to be about a kid who befriends a bunch of aliens, while also trying to prevent being taken and put into foster care. Basically, E.T. or more relevant, Lilo and Stitch, but with all the heart and likability sucked out of it. No, it's not about that at all. It's about a father who is so obsessed with aliens to the point where he neglects his son and has Child Protective Services called on Lewis, and when Lewis is about to be taken custody of from his father, the rest of the movie becomes a long wild goose chase where the characters are doing nothing but running around. And by the way, when I say this, I mean that literally. I may be getting ahead of myself when I'm saying this, but Lewis and the Aliens is the worst animated movie released in 2018. There is no competition. As you may be able to tell, I didn't like this one very much. Going into this one, I didn't think much of it. I thought it was just going to be an average kind of bad, considering the fact that in 2018, I dealt with both Monster Family and Duck Duck Goose. Both films are on a similar wavelength of bad, with one of them having an element that pushed it to be better than the other, and I thought that this one would be easy to deal with. I thought wrong. What I got was an incoherent mess that has so many elements that one-ups Monster Family and Duck Duck Goose on so many levels, to the point where I'm actually having trouble figuring out where to begin with my criticisms. Well, I guess we can start with the animation. Now, so far in Sean's yearly reviews, most of the movies that I've reviewed so far had pretty decent to even amazing animation. Heck, even the movies that I heavily dislike had pretty good animation in spite of some lip-syncing issues or generic designs. Well, in the case of Lewis and the Aliens, it breaks that streak completely. This movie is absolutely hideous. Now, Lewis and the Aliens doesn't have the worst animation that I've ever seen in an animated movie, because you could argue that the textures are halfway decent and the movements don't have any issues for the most part, and it's not as horrifying as Food Fight or as ugly in movements and looks as Ivan the Incredible. The problem with the animation in this movie all comes down to aesthetics and appeal. The issue with the animation in this movie is a very similar problem that a lot of people have with Shark Tale, where whatever design in this movie doesn't look very ugly, looks very generic, and the scenery in general makes the film very dull to look at. Also having a similar issue as Rock Dog, Boss Baby, Robot Boy, and Ollie's Pack, where their scenery is not interesting to look at either, on top of those products being boring or frustrating, but this movie doesn't even have good or average looking character designs to distract from this issue slightly. And with Shark Tale, you could at least argue that the movie might have looked better if it didn't try to either make the characters look like they're voice actors, or didn't try to make them look like fish or like the actual animals that they are, given that Finding Nemo was able to do this right. With Lewis and the Aliens, it doesn't even have an excuse for this problem. And this movie also completely misses the point of contrast. The humans are supposed to look friendlier than the aliens do, not look almost as ugly as them, and yeah, the aliens that the movie is named after do look much more disturbing than the humans do, especially when they shapeshift to them, which I'm pretty sure is going to be haunting people's nightmares for weeks. But the fact that they look almost as bad as the aliens feels very off. And also, if I may ask, why is this movie as ugly as it is, and how does it in any way fit with the tone that the movie is trying to go for? This movie is not dark like, say, Invader Zim or more relevant Aria monsters, which similarly had very ugly looking character designs, but it had a point there because that show was clearly going for that style. Because the show revolves around monsters who live in a garbage dump, figuring out ways to scare humans, and had a lot of dark jokes and was very dark in general. Lewis and the Aliens does not fit this style because the movie doesn't expect its audience to feel uneasy. This movie is clearly supposed to be a lighthearted comedy just like any other average kids movie nowadays. But hey, ignoring how ugly this movie is real quick, this movie also fails to give its viewers anything interesting to look at. Personally speaking, I don't mind if something looks ugly. I personally believe that as long as the execution of the actual animation is well done, then the product looking ugly should not matter at the end of the day. Toad Lyoko, despite having pretty awkward character designs, makes up for it in the actual animation. And with others like Ed, Edd n Eddy and Teacher's Pet, they could both be conceived as looking very ugly as well, but in execution, they're interesting to look at and are visually stimulating. Lewis and the Aliens is not well executed in any other aspect. Looking at this movie in the scenery is just as interesting as watching paint dry, meaning that this movie is not even interesting to look at, which only makes the factor of how bad the characters look even worse. And this movie also has a very similar issue as Shrek the Third, where the movie is set in areas that show off this very unpleasant shade of orange that makes the movie more ugly to look at, or in other cases, it's set in areas that show off very plasticky textures, indicating that this movie was very poorly rendered. I can't believe I'm saying this, but even Kuku Harajuku is more bearable to look at than this movie. That show also isn't good because it has no idea who it wants to appeal to, uses an idiotic character to further the plots, has very bland or unlikable characters, and also looks pretty bad in its character designs. But to that show's credit, it might have looked better if it toned down the color saturation a little bit and gave its characters different designs. Because even though I've been pretty harsh on the character designs, to the point where someone named Kawaii Life Antonio had noticed, he's a cool guy by the way, the show did have moments where it used character designs that are much better than how the actual show usually does it. You know that the animation in this movie is very bad, that it's making me give Kuku Harajuku some credit. But looking past the animation, how is the story and writing in this movie? What story? As stated at the beginning of this review, this movie has no story in the slightest, and any semblance of story that this movie does have are either plots and cliches that we've seen done elsewhere, or the story that this movie has was directly inspired by another animated movie. I already stated this before, but this movie is basically what you get if you took Lilo and Stitch, gender flipped the main character, and suck out all bits of charm, likability, and heart from the film. And not only make this movie incredibly stupid, but also make this movie just unpleasant, with sequences where not only is Lewis being bullied by the other students, but also gets put into a situation where he's about to be put into foster care, and his own father is too busy to help his own son in need. There's no longer a bond between two of the only characters that are left from this family that has been torn apart, so we're just watching a completely neglected child suffering throughout the film, as he's desperately trying to get his father to wake up so that he doesn't get taken away.
More on the father in a little bit.
Without anybody to talk to besides his crush and the aforementioned aliens. And the aliens themselves have a very stupid motivation for why they come to Earth. They only decide to put themselves into this stupid situation in the first place, not because they were forced into this whole thing in the first place like Stitch from Lilo and Stitch, where he had to escape because he was taken as prisoner. No, these aliens decided to do this because they wanted to order a vibrating mattress, not because they were forced onto that planet. And this movie also reminds me of Chicken Little in regards to the father and son dynamic, where you have this father figure who is very neglectful towards his own son and indirectly causes his son to be dumped on or be tormented throughout the film. Wouldn't be the first time that I've seen an animated movie that rips off Chicken Little in regards to its worst traits. Wow, if I had a nickel for every time that an animated movie that I've seen ripped off Chicken Little in regards to its worst aspects, the father and son relationship, I'd have 2 nickels.
Which isn't a lot. lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right?
And whenever this movie is not ripping off either Lilo and Stitch or Chicken Little, the writing in this movie is so broken and incoherent to the point where I could almost not consider this as writing, because almost nothing happens, and whenever something does happen, all it is characters running around, to the point where in 2019, when I first watched this movie, I actually gave this movie the nickname Wild Goose Chase the Movie, because that's literally what this movie is. Just a long wild goose chase through random locations before the climax comes around. While Lewis and the Aliens is not the worst animated movie that I've ever seen, I mean, I've yet to have gotten around to rewatching either Food Fight or Ivan the Incredible, this movie is definitely the worst written out of all of them so far. Heck, I've seen straight-to-DVD movies that have more of a story than this movie. And bear in mind, even though this movie wasn't released in theaters in the United States, it was able to be released in theaters internationally. But with writing like this, I'm just so stunned. And while the characters in this movie are not as bad as the characters in either Monster Family or Ivan the Incredible, they're extremely bland and extremely underdeveloped. And also, another thing to point out is that they could end up being absolute idiots. Lewis is one of those kind of one-dimensional protagonists, in that he doesn't even have a character, and he doesn't even have any interests like Nemo from Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland, or Bodhi from Rock Dog. Nor is he one of those characters that you'd want to see yourself with like Doug Funny or Arnold, because of how Lewis's father treats him throughout the movie. The aliens that the movie is named after are also not interesting, and it's baffling that they put themselves into a dangerous situation over a mattress. Lewis's crush, whom I don't remember the name of, does nothing throughout the film than just attempt to have her friend record things for a scoop but fails miserably. And Lewis's father, Armin Sontag, is without question the worst character in the entire movie. No competition. When I said that the movie rips off Chicken Little, I said this because of Armin Sontag, because the father and son relationship in this movie is directly on par with Chicken Little. Armin is not as bad as Buck Cluck because at the very least, the entire town doesn't hate Lewis because of him. Lewis's father takes something from Buck Cluck, and that is his neglectful attitude towards Lewis. And also, just like Buck Cluck, he's also responsible for Lewis constantly suffering throughout the film. Considering the fact that at the beginning of the movie, one of the neighbors basically calls Child Protective Services because of Armin Sontag's stupid decision to say that there were aliens in the neighborhood. And even worse, when the principal decides to set up an appointment for Lewis and his father to go to a meeting, Lewis's father refuses to wake up, while Lewis continues to suffer the consequences. I mean, the film tries to justify it by saying that he had a traumatic experience with aliens when he was younger, but that absolutely does not excuse how he's been acting throughout the rest of the film. And he's also an absolute idiot as well. Throughout the entire movie, he doesn't pick up the fact that Lewis is feeling absolutely miserable because of him. Nor does he ask any questions about how or why the principal is at their home. And he doesn't find out that the villain is wanting to take custody of him until he literally tells him near the climax of the movie. And despite the fact that Lewis literally said that his birthday is tomorrow, it had to take to the climax of the movie for him to find out that it's his own son's birthday. And despite the fact that, like Duck Duck Goose, even though the main antagonist is one of the only saving graces to this movie, she is definitely not enough to save the sinking ship of a feature, because the disastrous writing and animation brings it down to the point of no return. Alongside the fact that it steals elements from much better movies, barring Chicken Little. Getting up to the point where it's a tradition for me to recommend much better versions of certain movies to watch than the one that I'm reviewing. In this case, just watch Lilo and Stitch instead. It has a lot more likability, heart, charm, and most notably, an actual story! As for animated movies reviewed for Sean's yearly reviews, this film is definitely bottom 10 material. The top 10 worst animated movies reviewed for Sean's yearly reviews levels of bad. Monster Family and Duck Duck Goose may have worse characters by far, and Monster Family may be more unpleasant, but at least Monster Family and Duck Duck Goose had somewhat decent animation, and they had had way better writing than this movie. And considering some of the competition coming up, that is astounding. Oh, and for some reason, when I rewatched this movie for this review, during the other half of the movie, it suddenly froze, then the audio started to lag for the rest of the movie. Good thing I knew how the scenes were supposed to be like in my head. Maybe it was trying to warn me not to watch the rest of the movie, and considering how bad it is, that is definitely understandable.
Everything I